Greetings, fellow explorers, and welcome to the 14th episode of GKSP101, the podcast that explores the nexus between science, story, wonder, and philosophy. With me, your host, Dr. Yanis Kiston, and today we continue exploring the depths of marine science and Dungeons and Dragons with marine scientist and producer of Dungeons and Dugongs and Sea Dragons D&D podcast. It's like a tongue twister that I created for myself there. Professor Chris Parsons. How are you doing, Prof Parsons?
How are you doing? I'm doing fine.
That's good to hear. I'm excited to chat to you. You guys seem to have a very interesting little D&D podcast going on there that interests me as a fellow marine scientist. But before we get into that, why don't you tell our audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Well, at the moment, I am working for the US government in the National Science Foundation as what's called a AAAS Fellow, so the Association for Advancement of American Association for Advancement of Science Fellow. And I'm learning about basically how the government works while I'm doing science communication in the ocean section of the National Science Foundation. And before that, I was a professional podcaster for 2 years. Before that, I was an associate professor at a university in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy, studying whales and dolphins.
Okay, it's whales and dolphins is quite the charismatic field. I think every little marine biologist always wants to do that and then ends up elsewhere.
Yeah, it's pretty much what happened with me. From about the age of 5, I decided that I wanted to be a marine biologist, like the people I saw on TV documentaries. In fact, Jacques Cousteau, I used to watch religiously every Sunday. And I thought, I was going to do that. And unlike a lot of other little kids who decide they want to be an astronaut or whatever, I picked that job and I stuck with it. And I've been doing marine mammal research now for about 25 years.
That's a long time. Yeah, it's a similar story with me. I think I decided at 8, I want to be a marine biologist, went through school, higher education, ended up as an estuarine biologist, but close enough.
Well, I actually spend a lot of time standing on cliff tops, so I don't get onto the water as much as I would like. A lot of my research was doing land-based surveys for dolphins, and occasionally I get to go out on the boats, but quite frankly, my students had more fun on boats and cruising around and scuba diving and doing stuff like that. I spent way too much time in the laboratory.
Yeah. Nowadays, I think we spend a lot more doing writing and data analysis than anything, especially.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I basically sold an Excel spreadsheet most of the time rather than sailing the 7 seas.
Yeah, indeed. What are your days like now, being part of the government? What do you do day to day?
Well, it's very interesting. So the National Science Foundation is a government body that is responsible for basically giving out research grants. So I'm in the department there, which is responsible for giving out grants related to oceanography. So my job is kind of to highlight what sort of science that the government actually does fund, why it's important for society, and also if there are any new grants that are happening, just to sort of try and make people more aware that these sorts of things, these new opportunities are happening, and making sure that everyone in the science community gets to hear about it, not just a sort of a small bunch of people, but no matter where you are, whether you're at a community college or, a remote university or whatever, you can find out that there are these really cool projects happening, there's really cool science happening. So yeah, basically publicizing what it is that the government funds in terms of ocean science and how useful it is for society. So there's a lot of stuff that I'm talking about to people about impacts of climate change and underwater exploration and so forth at the moment.
Really, really important stuff. You get to decide, not really decide, but highlight things that are happening and what should be happening.
Really well, for example, just today, I posted out a whole bunch of stuff about a study that was funded, and in fact, underwater research vessels that were funded by National Science Foundation, and they discovered these barrels of DDT, which had been discarded off the coast of California in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And they found that they were just leaking out all this toxic chemical. And some of the barrels they discovered had just massive big holes in them. Presumably, they were sort of stabbing them or something to help make them sink. So, yeah, that's my job, and I'm doing it as what's called a AAAS fellow, and it's kind of like a sort of an apprenticeship to the government, although I'm quite old to be an apprentice. But some of the people who they take on in this scheme are, a lot of them are early career scientists, but some of them are mid-career, and some of them are late career scientists who decide that, they've been an academic for a long time, and now they want to find out how the government works, or they want to do something that has a bit more of an impact in Washington, D.C. And we sort of do this program where we learn how the government works and help out. So, yeah, it's quite a fun job.
Yeah, I can imagine it's interesting. So you had a stint where you were a professional podcaster for 2 years. How did you end up doing that?
Well, I had volunteered. I sort of got involved doing a couple of podcasts. And in fact, I think as all good projects start, it began due to a conversation in a bar. And I was talking to Andrew Lewin, who is a podcaster who produces the Speak Up for Blue podcast, which is a really big marine science podcast internationally. And we were chatting about science communication at a conference I was helping to organize. And he was very involved. He was going around interviewing a lot of the scientists who were at this conference. He was helping to sort of publicize it and so on. And so we were chatting in the bar, and I said to him, well, what would be really cool would be to do a podcast, kind of like Drunk History, something a little bit like that, where marine scientists get together over a couple of drinks. It's like the end of the day, the end of the week, Friday evening. You have a couple of drinks with your friends and you talk about the hot topics of marine science of that week, or what happened in the marine environment, or talk about the woes of being a marine biologist, or sometimes the fun times, sometimes the fun stories of being a marine biologist. And he thought it was a good idea, and we ended up producing the Marine Conservation Happy Hour podcast, which is now taken off. Gosh, I think we're like episode 300 or 400 now. So that took off, and then sort of one thing led to another. We ended up doing Dugongs and Sea Dragons, marine mammal science podcast, environmental studies and sciences, a whole bunch of different ones. And some of the new podcasts that we've started to produce in that network include Madam Curiosity, which is a Women in Science podcast, and Dancing in Pink Hiking Boots, which is all about the trials and tribulations of working in conservation and the environment, and the sort of stresses and strains, the difficulties about finding a job, and all those sorts of things, and to try and help people get through these troughs in their career so they can keep going in this very important type of field. So there's a wide variety of podcasts that we ended up producing, and some of them I hosted, some of them I edited and produced, some of them I just helped get people together because they had an idea that ended up becoming another podcast.
That sounds pretty cool. You got you had your fingers in various pies, I suppose, across the space and the podcasting space. Speaking of Dugongs and Sea Dragons, how did you get into D&D and then involved in that podcast?
Well, your last episode, you had Josh Drew, who's the dungeon master of Dugongs and Sea Dragons, and he mentioned a little bit about the story. So He was involved in the program committee of the International Marine Conservation Congress, which is a big academic marine conservation meeting, and it was being held in Kuching in Malaysia. And he was organizing with Travis Nielsen, who plays one of the characters in the podcast, who, in fact, is now become the producer and editor of it. As I've taken on this government job, I just didn't have the time. So Travis has sort of taken over that side of things. And they were talking about their love of Dungeons and Dragons. And we would just happen to be doing a live podcast at the conference. The end of the conference, we were going to have a whole bunch of guests up on stage, and we were going to interview them and record them for the Marine Conservation Happy Hour podcast. It was all going to be done in a bar, over a couple of drinks. And there was the suggestion of, you like playing Dungeons and Dragons, don't you? And I said, oh yeah, I'd love to play a game if you guys were doing it. And then suggested, well, why don't we actually record it like they do on the show Critical Role? And so it went from us going to play a game, just playing D&D all together as big nerds at this conference, to actually, well, let's just record it and have it as part of the conference program. And Josh put a lot of time and effort in to develop this storyline, which had lots of nerdy marine biology Easter eggs hidden in it, and it had an environmental plot. We had to save habitat for huge manatees. There were lots of puns in it. There were some people who were real experts at playing Dungeons and Dragons. Travis had been playing since he was a little kid, myself as well. Some people who had only learned how to play D&D like the day before. So a couple of people who we have in the podcast now, Heather Penny, played a little bit, or rather her boyfriend had played a little bit, and we just sort of pulled her in. Melissa Marquez had never played before. Frances Faribaum, who is a cast regular, she had never played before. Matt Tebow had never played before. So we had this really cool event. In fact, Matt and Francis, who are regular cast members, were in the audience and were so interactive and enjoyed it so much that we actually pulled them in when we decided that, this was a lot of fun. Maybe we should do it again. Then we looked at the download figures for that particular episode of the podcast. It was absolutely enormous. Huge number of people were downloading it. So we decided, let's try it as an actual show. Called in Francis and Matt, who were just so enthusiastic at the live event. They've been very interactive. They've been sort of throwing out banter to us and buying us drinks. So we thought, let's bring them in. And it just sort of took off from there, really. So we're now, I think we're well over 100 episodes in. We've actually done a couple of spin-off mini-series. So we have the regular plot, The Adventures of the Cephalus Squad, a bunch of not quite so heroic adventurers doing this very sort of piratical, nautical themed adventure. Lots of scientific nerdery inserted. Also quite a bit of history as well. So several of us are big history buffs. So in the recent episodes, we've had a whole thing about the history of the Republic of Pirates that was established on the Bahamas. And we sort of slipped a bunch of stuff in there. We've also slipped a bunch of homages to the musical Hamilton in. So we have this whole thing about the rise of the US as a nation that we've sort of slipped in little nerdy bits in there, as well as the marine biology. And we've had a couple of spin-off series. So at the moment, because it's Halloween, we're running a series called Terror and Tentacles, which is Call of Cthulhu. is the game engine that we're using, set in the 1940s. Last Halloween, we did an adventure that was set in Antarctica. So we brought in loads of Antarctic exploration history and the biology of penguins and killer whales and so on in Antarctica, and even a little bit of underwater physics, talking about sonar and so on, as well as I said, lots and lots of stuff about the history of Antarctica and also history of the Second World War. So we pulled that in, and that was a really successful series. So we repeated it again this year. Now the same adventurers are doing a mission in Scotland, and we're setting it in a location where they did all the sort of secret agents training in the Second World War. In fact, Christopher Lee, the famous actor who played Sauron in Lord of the Rings, was actually trained in this particular location, although we fantasized it a little bit, actually used the same classes that they taught at this spy school. So our characters go through these. And of course, there's a whole bunch of natural history that we insert in as well. So there's a lot of ecology of Scotland that gets put into the story. So that's what we've got running at the moment. We've had a little spin-off with some kids who play Dungeons and Dragons. So one of our NPC characters, Clog, a goblin who was actually catapulted at the party in an early adventure, the players decided to adopt him, and he actually became quite a major character. So we now have Clog, the goblin, being a plumber, a member of the Plumbers Guild, and he found this group of young orphans who recruited as plumber and adventurer apprentices, and they do their own adventures. So it's a bunch of kids ranging in age from, I think the youngest is 10 to 15. They come in, they do a special episodes, and we just had a spin-off of that spin-off where it's an all-girls team where one of the players from the previous spin-off has gathered together a group of female tween and teenage adventurers to go and solve problems and fight crimes and so on. So it's really a lot of fun. And we're now doing yet another spin-off. In fact, we've got two spin-offs coming in. One, The Adventures of Smauglock Holmes, which is being DM'd by Zeke Gonzalez, who is an ecologist at the University of Maryland. And he's also quite a prolific producer of D&D rule books as well. So he has this sort of great Victorian D&D type setting where we're solving crimes. And then we have Josh Delvia, who is DMing a Dark Sun setting adventure, which we're really getting into because I don't know if have you ever played the Dark Sun setting before?
No,
It's set in this world, which is, it's kind of like post-apocalyptic. It's kind of like Mad Maxy, where magic has devastated the environment and there's lots of civilization has kind of broken down. So it's really interesting from an environmental perspective. You can talk about environmental degradation and so on, and the history of the world that was. So our adventurers discover an aquarium, which is now no longer anywhere near the ocean. The ocean has gone. It's just these ruins. So it's piratical, but pirates in a desert, in a location that used to be oceans, but because of catastrophic environmental degradation is no more. So we're playing that with the other Josh, and slightly different themes. So as I said, it's a little bit bleaker, but still a very, very strong environmental message, very strong science message, and strangely marine biology, even though it's set in a desert. So that's fun. And that one should be coming online probably just after Christmas.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like you guys are having a lot of fun. playing a bit of D&D, podcasting it, and incorporating science into it. How do you go about incorporating science? Is it just offhand? Do you guys prepare anything like before a session, like notes you want to hit, or is it just random?
I have to say it's mostly random. Josh will try and design something so that there is some sort of creature that we find, or there's some sort of theme. So there's been a few episodes where he's taken, for example, an idea from one of his lectures. He thought, oh yeah, that would be really good as a theme for an adventure. So we have this whole venture about landscapes in fear, which is an ecological theory that he managed to insert. We had a sort of fantasy Galapagos Island adventure that we had. There's been numerous underwater ones where we went into a lot of detail about the physics and what it's actually like to be underwater. So quite a few of those, but most recent episodes, because we've been in this sort of pirate city, and quite frankly, we've been going off on lots of tangents, and we haven't been very good at following the plot. Haven't managed to get much of the sort of marine biology in. So to try and get something inserted in, we've kind of gone down this sort of history route, maritime history, as I said, history of the pirates, history, sort of political history, how the US was set up. So there's this whole riff about setting up, how to set up a pirate republic, almost like the setting up of the United States with a Senate and a Congress. There was also a really, really fun episode we had, which was basically us reliving all of our faculty meetings that we've been to, and we turned that into an episode, which was probably one of the funniest ones we did. In fact, when we recorded it, it was about 2 hours long, and we had to cut so much of it out because we just kept laughing and cracking it ourselves up. So if you listen to that one, yeah, that was a crazy episode, but that was a lot of fun to do.
Cool. Being involved with, is it AAAS, right? And the government and science communication, like what, like do you have your ear to the ground as to what the latest trends are in science communication? Like what has been spoken about at the high levels as to how we can now convey, these important pieces of information and knowledge to the general public in a way that they can understand and then use in their everyday lives?
Well, actually, part of my job is to try and bring some of the 21st century communication into the government. So they're very aware that they need to jump on the sort of the latest trends in terms of using social media and so forth, and communicating with podcasting companies to get the message out. So they're very aware of that side of stuff. But, the government is a big organism, and to sort of bring things into such a big organization, it takes time. So, but certainly they're very, very keen in learning about what to do and what needs to be done. And certainly there's a huge awareness about the need to communicate with the larger public, to get science out to the wider public, to get people to understand why it's important. So there's a really big understanding of the need to communicate. But it's a little bit like, I guess, sort of getting a big car started on a winter morning. It's a large vehicle. It takes a while to get stuff started, but they realize that, yes, but they've realized that, this is something that we really, really need to do. So there's a lot of support for it, and in particular, there's this big interest in coming up next year. In fact, is the launch of the UN Decade of the Oceans, and a big part of that decade's activity is to tell people about what's going on in terms of science, to make more connections with the marine coastal communities, with scientists, and to inspire the public about how awesome the oceans are and how awesome the science is that we're doing in the oceans. So this really big project starting off next year, I think is going to be a really good vehicle to help channel a lot of that science communication in cool and innovative ways.
Cool. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. So during your time as a researcher, what were some of the bigger research questions you were trying to answer, and what were your most interesting findings?
Well, one of the first projects I did, in fact, one of the first marine mammal projects I ever did was in South Africa.
That's where I'm from.
Well, it's actually a part of, it was part of South Africa then, although it's now Mozambique now.
I see.
But I studied humpback whales that swam past the coast at Cape Vidal National Park. And very, very cool project. We sat out on cliff tops and we saw humpback whales swim past. And it really sort of convinced me that, I've made the right decision here. This is fun. This is important. So I went on from there and I did a little bit of research, analyzing data from dolphin surveys on the west coast of Scotland. And then I went up and did my PhD in Hong Kong, in a location where there are these bright pink dolphins swimming around in Hong Kong Harbor. And their habitat was basically being destroyed because they were putting in a big airport. The dolphins used to swim around these two islands, and they were basically going to explode these two islands and turn them into an airport platform. So the habitat was just going to disappear. And the environmental impact assessment that they did for this area didn't even mention dolphins, because they employed benthic ecologists. They employed people who specialize in things that lived on the seabed. So they were just trawling up shellfish and sponges and stuff like that and recording it. And because dolphins weren't getting in their trawl nets, they were swimming around the boats, but they didn't let them down. So it's kind of classic scientist thing there, being really, really focused. They realized that they had a problem. They were going to put this huge airport in this location where there were pink dolphins, and no one had considered them in terms of the environmental impact assessment. So they brought myself and another researcher in to do a project to find out as much as we possibly could about the ecology and the behavior of the animals. So I studied these dolphins, and originally it was a behavioral ecological study looking at their behavior and where you found them at different times of the year. But we had so many animals wash up on beaches that we realized we had bigger problems, and these animals were washing up with signs of injuries from fishing nets or signs of injuries from being hit by boats or explosions. And as these animals were washing up in large numbers, I thought it'd be really interesting to look at pollution as well. The waters of Hong Kong were infamous for their high levels of pollution, and so maybe these pollutants were getting into the dolphins. So I took tissue samples and started analyzing them and looking at what the pollutant levels were, and we found some of the highest levels of mercury, some of the highest levels of DDT that have ever been recorded in these animals. In fact, the dolphins were so contaminated, they were supposed to have been disposed as toxic waste.
Yeah, that is hectic.
It was quite crazy. So because of that, we realized there were really big conservation issues. I spent a lot of time talking to government agencies about the problems, spent a lot of time talking to journalists, and that's where I got interested in science communication, going on TV and radio and talking to journalists and magazine editors about doing articles to just raise awareness, crazy types of awareness raising, like wandering around the streets of Hong Kong dressed as a pink dolphin. And we were pretty successful. We went from a situation where when we started the project, no one even knew there were dolphins there. As I said, the scientists who were doing the studies didn't even notice the dolphins, to when Hong Kong got handed over back to China, they had the pink dolphin as the national mascot on dolphins on the sides of skyscrapers, and they were giving out cuddly pink dolphins to kids. So it was a really good example of raising awareness about this threatened species, and they really became kind of the mascot of Hong Kong, and there was a lot of interest in helping to conserve and save them. So that was probably one of the biggest things, going from an area where no one knew anything about these dolphins to we ended up putting in a marine protected area. There ended up being legislation to save these dolphins. It was really quite a major project.
I can imagine that's really like fulfilling. You made a lot of impact in that time.
Yeah, it was pretty cool to be a PhD student and then see this massive neon pink dolphin that was your study species on the side of a building. And they kind of used a cartoon I drew as the basis of the mascot. So that was even better. Something I'd designed. They'd kind of taken that and they'd sort of elaborated on it, and yeah, that was pretty neat.
What do you think now is something we should be studying that we are not studying enough and will become a problem later on?
Oh my goodness. I mean, there are so many marine issues at the moment. Luckily, I would say that a lot of the problematic issues people are starting to study. For example, the emergence of novel diseases in the marine environment as the climate changes and diseases move into different areas. They may infect they may find new hosts that are less resistant to these diseases. So that's a hot topic area. Underwater noise is another issue where there's a lot of research going in at the moment. People are starting to realize what a problem that is. So I think there's a lot of issues that people are aware, and they're starting to do research, and there's a sort of big push to find out the impacts and threats of these particular issues. Where we have the biggest problem is, I think, in the marine environment, is how all of these problems and threats interact and are synergistic. So how does climate change interact with pollutants and interact with diseases? Are they synergistic? Do they sort of add on together? Is there sort of like a positive feedback loop that just makes things even worse? So I think that's the area. People tend to, when they study things, they study like one pollutant or one threat or one issue. But what's the effect of combining all of these threats together on the health of marine species? I think that's the big challenge that we have at the moment. People are looking into it, but it's just so incredibly difficult and also so incredibly expensive as well, particularly when you're looking at impacts on deep water species, the deep sea environment. Getting to do research at 3 kilometers underwater is really, really difficult to do. And you're talking about an expense of tens of $20,000 a day just to operate the boat, let alone everything else. So I think that's the biggest challenge, trying to find out all these cumulative effects of all these threats and stresses and how we can deal with them. Are there a couple of the threats that we can remove to make the species and populations more resilient to things like climate change? If we just removed the underwater noise, or if we just removed the pollution, would that make the biggest difference? Kind of like a game of Jenga, really, where you have the blocks, which of these blocks is the most important? Are there a couple that you can remove and it makes the population more stable?
Okay, yeah, it's synergistic effects are tough to deal with. I know I did some of that work for my PhD. Well, like I was just trying to test synergistic effects with like salinity and like temperature, and that was a bunch of different permutations. And the more things you add, the more permutations you have to add to your experiment, and there's just no time and no funding for all of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you're working in an estuary as well, where you can drive to an estuary usually.
Yeah.
You can use a small boat, hopefully, which is not that expensive. So imagine trying to do those sorts of studies out in the Middle Atlantic Ridge.
In the middle. Yeah. It's I don't know how we're going to manage it in time, if we ever do. So going back to D&D, what are your fondest memories of playing the game, of role-playing?
Well, I started learning D&D when I was about 11 years old. So I actually learnt in the back of math class. So I was in a class where I guess I was on the nerdiest table. And me and my friends tended to finish our exercises before everyone else. And we would get bored. So our math teacher was very wise and said, if you finish early, you can just play D&D at the back of the class. So not only did that keep us occupied, and the math teacher realized that playing D&D, there's a lot of math involved, particularly in first edition Dungeons and Dragons, way back when, advanced Dungeons, where you had tables and charts. It's a lot more complicated than fifth edition. You had to look everything up on a chart. So they realized that kept us busy and happy, and we actually ended up finishing our exercises even faster and making sure that they were perfect so we could play more in D&D. So it was a really good strategy. So that kind of got me started on it. And another one of our teachers started up a D&D class in the chemistry labs during lunchtime, which was great because growing up in the southwest of England, it rained all the time. And the other option was to be outside in the pouring rain, being miserable, or we could be inside in the chemistry labs playing D&D. And our chemistry and biology teachers were there supervising, and they were, again, quite cunning. They would sort of throw all sorts of chemistry stuff at us as we were playing. So I guess that was kind of an early inspiration for Dugongs and Sea Dragons, what our teachers used to do for us. And just sort of started from there. So way back with the original basic set back in 1981, I think it was, through Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, to now playing 5th edition and Pathfinder and a whole bunch of other games. So I've gone from playing games to helping out people writing D&D books now. So we actually have several books, Scientific Secrets of series on DM's Guild, Scientific Secrets of Saltmarsh, Scientific Secrets of Icewind Dale, which is the most recent one, where we have actual species that we've turned into fantasy creatures. So each creature that we have in these books has got some sort of scientific facts inserted into its creature description. So we've been doing sort of some of those books and so forth. And you remember I mentioned working in Hong Kong. I actually ended up doing several sections in the World of Darkness series, the Vampire the Masquerade, if you've ever played that. I ended up doing several sections of their Hong Kong source book. So actually managed to insert some environmental issues and the pink dolphins into that source book. So a bit of stealth science education there.
Very cool. I mean, you've done a lot of different things during your career. Where do you see yourself later in life, approaching retirement, if you ever do? Like, what would you like to see yourself? What position would you like to be in?
I don't know. I'm kind of thinking about that at the moment. Do I want to continue working in the government? Do I want to work with an environmental organization? Do I want to go back into academia or not? So I'm kind of at a crossroads. I definitely realized that science communication was really, really important, and was something that I wanted to do. Basically, as an academic, producing paper after paper after paper, and then looking at the download rates and seeing that I was spending all this work and all this effort, and hardly anyone was reading it. So what do I do? Well, let's try and publicize it. So that's kind of how I got into the science communication side of stuff, and also in the policy side of stuff as well. If you're working in conservation, you have to find out how this conservation actually gets enacted. So I guess getting more involved in that side of stuff, continuing being involved in communication, getting more involved in policy while continuing doing the science. But I don't know what sort of medium that's going to be in. Is it going to be going back to academia? Is it going to be carrying on in the government? Is it going to be working for an environmental group? Or is it going to be something completely different? I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely understand the feelings about getting very low views on your research articles. Some things can be so niche that only you and your reviewers might read the paper.
Actually, for one of my papers, I did mention that the average readership of a scientific paper is about 2 people once it's been published. Yeah. And chances are one of those is probably going to be your mom or dad. Hey, I published a paper. Oh, that's nice. I have no idea what this is. The average readership of a scientific paper is about 2. The average readership of a humanities paper is less than half.
Really?
So it's
That's crazy.
Pretty grim. Yeah. And then you look at, how many people listen to a podcast? I mean, it can be pretty impressive. So, quite frankly, for a lot less effort, you can get a lot more impact on a podcast, or in fact a D&D book. Oh my goodness, the number of downloads we get for the D&D books that we do, it's just incredible. So it's choosing a medium that has the biggest bang for the buck.
I think it is in general about like providing value. And I mean, a research paper, I think, tends to provide value to the entire body of knowledge, but it doesn't really target specific everyday people, unless like sometimes you are just targeting another researcher that's going to cite your work for their work, and it just like, tumbles down. Where something like a guide for D&D, like anybody who plays D&D can find that useful. So it's 2 different sources of value for 2 different audiences. And I think that's where the importance of science communication comes in, because now you are creating content for specific audiences and you're creating value that's different from a research article. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is something you could probably relate to as a scientist producing papers, that even if a scientist cites you, even if they mention your paper, chances are they probably haven't even read it. Because I've seen now the number of times people have cited my papers and they clearly have not read it. They've gone to Google and said, I need to put in a paper about this type of dolphin. So put in that name. What's the first thing that pops up? Yeah, I'll stick that in. They clearly haven't even looked at it. So it's quite depressing that if you look at the downloads of your scientific papers, If you then go and find out how many people have read past the abstract, it's really, really low. It's really quite depressing. So, yeah, even if your paper's cited, it doesn't have any guarantee that the person's even read it. So producing a paper should be like the first stage of publicizing it. It's okay. You've got the paper done. You've jumped through all this hoops of getting it reviewed and so on. It's published. That should just be one stage. The next stage should be you write a press release about it. You go and contact some science podcasters about it and why it's really, really cool. You go and post it on social media. Because quite frankly, if you just leave it as it's published and I'm not going to do anything else about it, it's really going to have very little impact. And quite frankly, for you as well as a scientist, if no one reads your papers, it's not going to help your career. So it's useful for you to take that paper and then publicize it, do a press release, put it out on Twitter, put it out on Facebook, share it with environmental groups, share it with with all sorts of other bodies. So definitely it's worth it for you, and it's also worth it for science, because science wants to be read. Science wants to be known.
Indeed. If science was an anthropomorphic thing, science would not be,
yes.
Science would want to be read. So you mentioned, speaking to scientific podcasters about getting your message out there. Like what do you think the strengths are to podcasting, and what might be their weaknesses communicating science, if any?
Oh, I think there's a lot of strength in podcasts. One big strength is that they're really cheap to do. As you can probably, you have to make a good one, you need good podcasting equipment, but it's pretty cheap, really. You take your podcast, you upload it on Libsyn or whatever, and out it goes. And compared to, for example, producing a video or some such, or even producing flyers. If you think about how much it costs to produce 200 color flyers and put them out, you could have had a really good podcast for that amount of money. So one of the big strengths is the cheapness. They're relatively easy to edit compared to, for example, editing video. It doesn't take much. And in fact, as a dolphin biologist, I was already using Audacity to analyze my dolphin clicks and whistles. So, cool. Hey, already had it.
Already had the skills.
So pre-adapted, as they say. So that was useful. So relatively easy to edit. And I think one of the biggest benefits of podcasts is that you hear scientists talking about scientists in their own words. So as opposed to, for example, a press release that your university press office produces, or a journalist who tries to talk about your science, chances are they're probably going to make some mistakes and they might get it wrong. Whereas on a podcast, you can actually tell the audience directly about your science and know that you're talking about it correctly. It's not going through a third person or a fourth person. The game Telegraph, where you whisper something to someone and they whisper it to someone else. Sometimes science communication is a little bit like that. The paper gets interpreted and then gets reinterpreted, and then the journalists on the TV talks about it, and it gets garbled by the time it actually gets out to the audience. Whereas with a podcast, you cut out a lot of those middle people and you talk to the audience directly. I think it also has a benefit in you can get some of the personality of the scientist who's doing the science too, which you don't really get from reading a newspaper article. You don't really get from reading a paper. And anything that can make scientists three-dimensional, less alien, less weird, less scary, less intimidating, I think is great, because it then helps to make scientists appear like normal people to the general public. Oh yeah, I know that science guy. It's like, people listen to Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye the Science Guy and David Attenborough because they can relate to them. They're not some sort of elite, strange creature, scary creature in a white lab coat. It's like, oh yeah, I know Chris. I listen to his podcast. Yeah. His stuff is really interesting, and I listen to it and trust what they say. So making scientists three-dimensional, I think, is a really great benefit. Plus, also, if you make a scientist three-dimensional, it may play a role in terms of inspiring other people to become scientists. So maybe there are kids out there listening to this podcast who are, 12, 13, 14, who are thinking, what am I going to do with my life? Well, yeah, marine biology sounds pretty cool. I'm a nerd. I like Dungeons and Dragons. I like marine science. Hey, maybe that's the career for me.
Yeah. I definitely agree. And when you are trained, to do scientific writing, you kind of are trained to remove your personality out of it. Like, you're not even supposed to write I or we or first person. And there's, strict kind of guidelines onto how to write a paper. So you completely remove your personality. So putting your personality back into the work, I think, is helpful. Also, just thinking about the way human culture involved and like how we like to tell stories and hear stories from each other. I think, that's much more helpful in a podcast setting, just to have that personability with the people doing work or teaching. Compared to a science, a research paper is not for the layman to read, unfortunately.
No, absolutely not. And particularly social science. Oh my goodness, those papers can be really, really dense. And as you said, storytelling is a medium that we evolved to use to help us survive. When we were sitting around a fire in a cave, we use stories to tell people about our experiences so that our offspring or our family members could avoid the black and white poisonous spider or eating the rotten fruit and getting sick. So stories have become part of our evolution. A way that we got a competitive advantage over other species, and a way that we survived in our environment. So I think it's really ingrained in us biologically that we communicate via stories. So we can communicate science via stories, then it just becomes so much easier. It's so much more natural. Communicating via scientific paper is pretty unnatural.
Yeah, it's about as abstract as it gets.
Yes,
for sure. And I was just thinking, like, Dugongs and Sea Dragons is pretty much the convergent evolution of taking the science and putting it back into story, which is really cool.
Absolutely.
And I think, we've spent just under about an hour, and it was quite fun chatting. I think for the final question, this is a fun one that I asked Prof Drew last time, but if you had an infinite amount of resources, what kind of either scientific related or D&D related or podcasting related work would you do or try and get done?
Infinite amount of resources. Well, there's several different things I would like to do. I mean, in terms of dolphin science, it would be really cool to try and find out how dolphins really perceive the world and to sort of try and communicate with them. And there's some really cool science going on at the moment with the likes of Dr. Diana Rees and Denise Herzig, where they're looking at the behavior of dolphins. I'd like to throw a huge amount of money at them so that they can do cool things with, like, one of the projects they've got is they've actually got dolphins playing computer games to try and work out how they see the environment and how they interact.
Research, yeah.
And they're doing kind of almost like a speak and spell type thing, and they're sort of doing this as a way to try and get dolphins to communicate. So they're teaching them symbolic languages, kind of like the studies that they did with primates. In the beginning of the movie Planet of the Apes, and they're trying to do that with dolphins. So I'd throw a whole bunch of money for them to do that with dolphins, but in the way that the dolphins are not kept in a tiny little pool, and they're kept in like a really nice big marine environment so that they're happy and healthy and well looked after, not in some sort of tiny enclosure. So yeah, to find out what's going on there with dolphins would be a really cool one. Of course, saving a lot of different species, throwing money at developing countries to try to train up local scientists and local activists to help save species and help get engaged in conservation would be a big thing too. But a super cool thing would be to have like underwater laboratories that you could live in all year round, kind of like some of these fantasy settings, sci-fi stuff, where actual underwater laboratories where you could live all year round doing your science in deep sea environments, and then you could pop out, you could collect your data, go back into the facilities and live there and find out some more about the ecology and conservation and the science behind some of these more elusive species. And for communication, if I had all the money in the world, I would actually, one thing I would, it doesn't need all the money in the world, but it does need a bit of money. I would do a really big push in trying to get Hollywood to be better at portraying science and including science in movies and TV shows. I would set up a whole group of people living there, talking to producers and directors to make sure that when you had like a cop show, they actually consulted with scientists when they were doing a cop show, or if they're doing a sci-fi show, that they actually consulted heavily with NASA and made sure that the science was correct. And they featured scientists regularly as characters and heroes in stories, so that when kids were growing up, they would just be bombarded with, first of all, good science in the shows that they're watching, and also good scientists as role models. Because really, if you see a scientist on TV these days, mostly it's not a terribly positive portrayal. Either they're an evil villain or they're just really socially awkward. Very rarely do you see a cool scientist that people want to be. I mean, you see cool engineers like MacGyver and people like that, but you don't really see many cool scientists. So if I had a bit of money, I would set up some sort of NGO in Hollywood and Bollywood. Bollywood in Hong Kong, anywhere where there's a big movie industry, to try and get scientists portrayed in a good light and try and get scientists put into TV shows and movies, because that's where most people get their information from watching TV.
Yeah.
And inspired as well. So
at least their culture and how they try and navigate through life. A lot of that comes through the media that they're consuming. And
absolutely. I mean, you think about how many kids who, Christmas comes up and what do you want for Christmas? Oh, I want an X-Men outfit, or I want some Star Wars figurines. Wouldn't it be cool if, what do you want for Christmas? Oh, I want a Dr. Geekoscopy outfit.
It would be
or
cool.
action figure.
Yeah.
I've got all my Funko dolls of these cool scientists. Wouldn't that be awesome?
Yeah. One of my colleagues, I'm not really sure. I don't think he's a scientist. He's a coder. But he started an initiative called Super Scientists, where he makes superheroes out of everyday scientists, and he has this like cards, like baseball cards with like stats, and it's a pretty cool initiative. I'm hoping that it gets off the ground, but it does portray scientists in kind of these like super powered kind of ways, and yeah, I would check that out. Might be
I kind of like that. Like trading cards for scientists. I wonder if I could mention that at work and go, hey, you know what we should do? We should have like trading cards for scientists and give them away at events, and have kids trying to, I've got another Bob Ballard. Yeah, I'll swap you a Bob Ballard for Chris Parsons. There you go.
Yeah, it's an idea. But I think we can end with that. And with that, it's time to pack up camp and head back to our labs and/or fantasy worlds. But first, why don't you let our fellow explorers know where they can find you and your work on the internet, Prof Parsons?
Well, you can find my podcasts at Marine Conservation Happy Hour. So if you just go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can find me there. You can also find us at Dugongs and Sea Dragons as well. And you can find me on social media on Twitter at Kraken_McCrack.
Kraken McCrack, yeah. Well, what I would advise is try and like show on your accounts who you are, because like I had no idea who controls the Dugongs and Sea Dragons Twitter, who Kraken McCrack is, where Chris Parsons lives on the internet. It was quite confusing. But I don't know, maybe it's just your style. You like to keep an air of mystery about you.
Yeah, I like to have a secret alter ego like Batman.
Indeed, but I will put your information down in the description. And thank you, Prof Parsons, for joining. And thank you to listener for sparing your time. I hope you guys had fun listening and learning with us today. Otherwise, stay safe, keep well, stay tuned, and cheers.
Thank you very much.